China released 1 million rabbits into the desert. What happened next shocked the world.
In 1988, a salt mine manager in northern China named Wang Wenbiao faced a problem that had nothing to do with ecology and everything to do with keeping his business alive. He had just taken over a nearly bankrupt salt works sitting in the middle of the Kubuqi Desert, a roughly 18,600 square kilometer expanse of shifting sand dunes in Inner Mongolia, and the salt he produced had no reliable way to reach a train depot that sat just 65 kilometers away as the crow flies. Without a direct route through the desert, every shipment had to travel a roundabout 350-kilometer path instead, and during the region's frequent sandstorms, even that longer route shut down completely. Wang built a direct road through the dunes. The desert swallowed it almost immediately. What started as one desperate businessman's attempt to keep a road open eventually grew into one of the largest land restoration projects on Earth, and nearly 4 decades later, roughly a third of that same desert is green. Before we get into how that happened, if you're into real, deeply researched nature stories like this one, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. To understand the scale of what Wang was up against, you have to understand what centuries of unchecked grazing had already done to the Kubuqi region by the late 20th century. Once covered in enough grassland to support a scattered population of livestock herders, the area had been stripped of vegetation over generations, leaving behind bare, mobile sand dunes that swallowed roads, encroached on farmland, and periodically buried entire sections of nearby villages. Around 740,000 people lived in and around the desert's edge in a state of persistent, isolated poverty, with local infrastructure limited enough that many families were still building homes out of mud and straw bricks well into the late 20th century. Wang's realization, once his own road kept failing, was that fixing the desert and fixing the region's poverty could not be treated as two separate problems. In his own later description of the philosophy that shaped the project, welfare work alone would never prove sustainable. Any restoration effort ambitious enough to actually hold back an 18,000 square kilometer desert would need to generate real income for the people living there, not just plant trees and hope they survived. That founding insight shaped nearly every technical decision that followed. Elion Resources Group, the company Wang built around the restoration effort, began experimenting with a dune stabilization method that had actually originated decades earlier and roughly 200 kilometers away in the city of Zhongwei near the Tengger Desert, where engineers first developed what became known as the straw checkerboard technique more than 60 years ago. Workers press bundles of straw into the sand in a grid pattern, creating a checkerboard of small barriers across the dune surface. Each square traps blown sand, slows wind speed at ground level, and creates just enough shelter for seeds and young plants to establish roots without being immediately buried or exposed by shifting sand. A low-cost, low-technology solution that has since been documented improving both the physical structure and chemical composition of desert soil wherever it has been applied at scale. Early attempts at revegetation on top of these stabilized dunes struggled badly. Elion initially paid local workers simply to plant trees across the reclaimed sand, and most of those first plantings died before ever taking hold, the harsh desert conditions overwhelming saplings faster than crews could get them established. The company adjusted its approach, shifting to financial incentives tied specifically to keeping planted trees alive rather than paying only for the initial planting labor, and developing faster, more efficient planting techniques, including a method using high-pressure water jets that allowed workers to plant a single willow seedling in as little as 10 seconds, dramatically increasing how much ground a limited workforce could cover across a landscape this vast. The straw checkerboard technique deserves a closer look, since it represents exactly the kind of unglamorous, low-cost engineering that made restoration at this scale financially possible. Rather than relying on expensive imported machinery, workers press ordinary wheat or rice straw directly into the sand by hand, forming a grid of small squares, typically around a meter across, that break up wind flow at ground level. Research measuring the technique's effectiveness has found that these straw barriers significantly reduce sand movement compared to untreated dunes, while also gradually improving the physical and chemical properties of the soil trapped within each square, as decomposing straw adds organic material to sand that otherwise contains essentially none. Because the materials involved are cheap, locally available agricultural waste, the technique could be deployed across thousands of square kilometers by a large seasonal workforce without the kind of capital investment that would have made a project this size financially impossible for most organizations to attempt. Selecting the right plant species mattered just as much as the planting technique itself. Elion's restoration teams focused heavily on drought-resistant species capable of actually surviving Kubuqi's harsh, arid conditions, including licorice, a plant whose roots help fix nitrogen in depleted desert soil, while also producing a genuinely valuable commercial crop used in traditional Chinese medicine, giving local farmers a direct financial incentive to cultivate it across restored land, rather than treating restoration purely as unpaid environmental labor. The licorice cultivation that became such a central part of Kubuqi's economic model deserves closer explanation, since it illustrates exactly the kind of dual-purpose thinking that separated this restoration from simpler, purely symbolic tree planting efforts elsewhere. Licorice root has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for centuries, valued both as a standalone remedy and as a common ingredient blended into other herbal formulations, giving it a stable, long-standing commercial market independent of anything related to desert restoration. Its root system also happens to fix nitrogen in depleted soil, gradually improving the fertility of the sandy ground it grows in much the same way legume crops enrich farmland elsewhere in the world. Elion's restoration teams recognized that pairing an economically valuable crop with a genuinely useful ecological function meant local farmers had a direct, ongoing financial incentive to maintain licorice cultivation on restored land indefinitely, rather than treating the crop as a one-time subsidized planting that might be abandoned once initial funding or interest faded, a distinction that mattered enormously for the project's ability to sustain itself across decades rather than years. That same nitrogen-fixing property also meant licorice fields functioned as small, self-renewing pockets of soil improvement scattered across the broader restoration zone, each one making the surrounding sand slightly more hospitable to whatever native grasses or shrubs researchers were attempting to re-establish nearby. Progress remained slow and uncertain for years, closer to trial and error than any confident master plan, but research tracking vegetation cover across the region found a clear turning point beginning around 2001, after which the pace of greening accelerated sharply compared to the slower, more gradual changes recorded in the project's earlier years. By roughly 3 decades after Wang first took over the failing salt works, independent researchers and Elion's own reporting converged on a similar headline figure. Approximately 1/3 of the entire Kubuqi Desert, an area now measured at around 6,000 square kilometers, had been transformed from bare sand into what the company describes as sustainable green land. The ecological data behind that headline figure is substantial. According to figures Wang has presented publicly, vegetation coverage across the restored area now exceeds 53%, up from a desert that supported essentially none decades earlier. The number of documented biological species living within the restored zone has grown from 123 to 530. Water conservation capacity, once close to zero across the barren dunes, has grown to more than 25 billion cubic meters, and the restored land is now estimated to sequester more than 15 million tons of carbon. Figures that reflect not just more plants growing on the surface, but a genuinely different, more water-retentive, more biologically active desert ecosystem underneath. The economic transformation running alongside that ecological recovery has proven just as significant to the people who actually live in the region. Restored land in Kubuqi now supports cattle grazing, tourism infrastructure including locally run hotels and restaurants built to serve visitors drawn to the newly green dunes, and large-scale solar energy development, since the same intense, near-constant sunlight that once made Kubuqi so inhospitable to plant life turns out to make it exceptionally well-suited to photovoltaic power generation. Elion has since built solar installations across the restored desert, generating hundreds of megawatts of electricity, in some cases growing crops like potatoes and pumpkins directly beneath the panels, combining land restoration, agriculture, and renewable energy production on the same reclaimed ground. Company figures indicate more than 100,000 farmers and herders across the region have been lifted out of poverty as a direct result of the combined restoration and economic development effort. The willow planting technique Elion refined over the project's early years became one of the restoration's most widely replicated methods. Rather than planting a full sapling the way conventional forestry typically works, crews instead pushed cut willow branches directly into holes created by a high-pressure water jet, letting a single worker plant dozens of new cuttings in the time it would have taken to properly plant even a handful of container-grown saplings. Willows root easily from cuttings under the right soil moisture conditions, and once established, their root systems further stabilize the surrounding sand, making each successfully rooted willow slightly more helpful to whatever gets planted near it next. This combination, straw checkerboards first, then fast, high-volume willow planting, became the core repeatable formula Elion's crews applied across thousands of square kilometers of dune over the following decades. Wang Wenbiao's own account of the project's early years describes a level of trial and error considerably messier than the polished, unified vision the restoration is sometimes credited with in hindsight. Elion's very first tree planting efforts, before the company shifted to incentive-based payment tied to tree survival rather than simple planting labor, reportedly resulted in the deaths of most of what was planted, an expensive and demoralizing early setback for a project still operating without any guarantee of eventual success. Wang has since taken to referring to himself publicly as the son of the desert, framing his decades-long involvement in Kubuqi's restoration as a personal calling rather than a purely commercial venture, even though the underlying business model, generating revenue through licorice cultivation, tourism, and solar energy on reclaimed land, remained central to making the restoration self-sustaining rather than dependent on indefinite outside funding or government subsidy. Kubuqi's transformation now sits within a much larger national effort. The 3 North Shelter Belt program, often referred to internationally as China's Great Green Wall, was launched by the Chinese government in 1978 and represents a vastly larger, longer-running campaign against desertification, stretching across the country's arid and semi-arid north, of which the Kubuqi restoration became one of the most closely studied and most frequently cited regional success stories. The United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification has specifically praised China's broader approach, with the organization's executive secretary describing the country as among the most advanced in the world at large-scale land restoration, and delegations from other arid nations, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, have since visited Kubuqi directly to study whether elements of the model might transfer to their own desertification challenges. The solar energy component of Kubuqi's restoration has grown into one of the project's most visually striking elements, and one that illustrates how thoroughly the region's original liability, unrelenting, harsh sunlight with almost nothing to block it, was eventually converted into an economic asset. The desert receives an average of more than 3,100 hours of usable sunlight annually, among the highest solar exposure levels found anywhere in China, conditions that make it exceptionally well suited to large-scale photovoltaic power generation once the shifting sand beneath the panels has been stabilized enough to support permanent infrastructure. Individual solar installations built across the restored desert now generate hundreds of megawatts of electricity, feeding power into the regional grid while simultaneously providing enough partial shade at ground level to support crop cultivation directly beneath the panel arrays, a dual land use strategy that lets a single stretch of reclaimed desert generate both electricity and food at once. The 3 North Shelter Belt program that Kubuqi's restoration eventually became a flagship example within is staggering in its own right, independent of any single regional project. Launched in 1978 and originally planned to run in phases through 2050, the program aims to plant a series of forest shelter belts stretching across northern China's arid and semi-arid provinces, intended to function as a wind-blocking barrier limiting the expansion of the Gobi and other northern deserts toward populated agricultural regions further south and east. China's own government reporting has described measurable, sustained reductions in the total area affected by desertification nationwide over the decades since the program's launch, even as researchers studying individual regions like Kubuqi have cautioned that separating the effects of deliberate afforestation from broader climatic shifts remains genuinely difficult, particularly given the warming and slightly wetter conditions documented across much of northern China in recent decades. None of this happened as quickly or as cleanly as the headline statistics might suggest, and researchers studying the region have been careful to note that climate factors, specifically a broader regional trend towards slightly warmer, wetter conditions across northern China in recent decades, have likely contributed to the vegetation recovery alongside the deliberate restoration work itself, making it difficult to cleanly separate how much of Kubuqi's greening reflects Elion's specific interventions versus a broader, more favorable shift in regional climate patterns. What is not in dispute is the scale of what has changed on the ground. A desert that swallowed a desperate businessman's road in 1988 now supports grazing cattle, solar farms, licorice crops, hotels, and hundreds of thousands of formerly impoverished residents. Roughly a third of its total area transformed from lifeless sand into functioning, productive land within less than 4 decades. If you enjoy real, verified stories from the wild edges of nature, like this video, leave a comment letting me know what you thought and subscribe for more. I will see you in the next one.